Sir, we received a report about a suspicious payment. Can you explain this check?
It's a verified cashier's check. Am I being detained or is this voluntary?
At this point, we need to confirm everything. Do you have identification on you?
Yes, I'll provide ID, but I do not consent.
The late afternoon sun was cutting a harsh golden angle through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Westbridge Motors showroom, casting long shadows over the polished hoods of imported luxury vehicles. The air inside was climate-controlled to a perfect 70 degrees, smelling faintly of tire rubber, expensive leather, and the complimentary espresso brewing in the customer lounge. Marcus sat in a low-slung modern chair, staring at his phone, feeling the quiet exhaustion of a grueling 80-hour work week finally beginning to bleed out of his shoulders. He was 34, dressed in dark denim, a crisp but unbranded navy sweater, and worn-in boots. He didn't look like a millionaire, but in his interior jacket pocket rested a cashier's check for $115,000, representing the culmination of a massive software deployment his consulting firm had just successfully closed. The check was made out to Westbridge Motors. Marcus was here to buy the matte gray Grand Touring Coupe sitting right in the center of the floor, a quiet reward to himself for 3 years of relentless hustle. He had already test-driven it on Tuesday. He had already negotiated the out-the-door price with a young, eager salesman named Josh. All that was left was handing over the paper and signing the title work. Josh had practically been vibrating with excitement when Marcus handed him the heavy, watermarked slip of paper. The young salesman had carefully placed it in a blue folder and jogged over to the finance glass box office at the back of the showroom. That was 45 minutes ago. The complimentary espresso had gone cold. The low hum of the dealership's ambient pop music felt increasingly grating. Marcus shifted his weight, his eyes drifting toward the finance office. Behind the glass sat Cynthia. She was the senior finance director, a woman in her late 50s with sharp, meticulously sprayed blonde hair, wearing a tailored blazer that armor-plated her posture. From his vantage point, Marcus could see her desk, but he couldn't hear the conversation. What he could see was Cynthia holding his cashier's check up to the light. Then she set it down. Then she pulled up something on her dual-monitor display. Then she picked up the phone, her eyes briefly darting through the glass, locking onto Marcus for a fraction of a second before darting away. It was a look Marcus knew intimately. It wasn't a look of customer service, and it wasn't a look of administrative delay. It was the look of assessment. A rapid, internal calculus where someone takes the sum total of your appearance, your presence, and their own preconceived notions, and arrives at a conclusion that places you entirely outside the realm of the benefit of the doubt. In her office, Cynthia wasn't calling the issuing bank. The issuing bank was a regional commercial branch barely 2 miles down the road. It was open. A simple phone call to the branch manager, referencing the routing and account numbers, would have verified the funds in less than 90 seconds. Instead, Cynthia was looking at a third-party fraud alert database that the dealership used for personal checks, a system notoriously unreliable for certified bank drafts. She was looking at the sum, $115,000. She was looking through the glass at the young black man in the plain sweater and worn boots sitting in her waiting area. The two pieces of information refused to reconcile in her mind. Her gut told her something was wrong. It was a feeling she often prided herself on, an instinct she believed kept the dealership safe from scammers. She didn't see a successful tech consultant. She saw an anomaly. An anomaly holding a piece of paper that looked too pristine, with a signature she decided looked slightly hesitant. She dialed the non-emergency dispatch line for the local police department. Her voice was hushed, urgent, and perfectly calm. She reported a suspected fraud in progress. She stated she had a suspect in the lobby attempting to purchase a high-end vehicle with what she strongly believed was a forged cashier's check. She offered no proof, no call to the bank, only her tenure, her title, and her unyielding assumption. 15 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the showroom slid open. The sudden shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable. 2 patrol officers stepped onto the tile floor. The first was Officer Miller, young, fresh-faced, with his thumbs tucked into his duty belt. The second was Officer Davies, older, broader, with a weary, authoritarian heaviness to his walk. They didn't look at the cars, they scanned the room. Cynthia immediately stepped out of her glass office, waving them over with a tight, professional smile. She ushered them into the back hallway, out of earshot. Marcus watched this unfold. His heart rate ticked up, a slow, steady drumbeat of realization. The cold espresso suddenly tasted like ash in the back of his throat. He knew exactly what was happening, and yet, a small, rational part of his brain fought against it, telling him to stay seated, telling him it was a misunderstanding, a routine check for a large transaction. But the rational mind rarely accounts for the sheer speed at which institutional bias operates. When Davies and Miller emerged from the hallway, they did not walk to the sales desk. They walked directly toward Marcus. The dealership grew uncomfortably silent. Josh, the young salesman, stood frozen near the reception desk, clutching a clipboard to his chest, his eyes wide. Davies stopped 5 feet from Marcus, taking a bladed stance. Miller stepped slightly to the side, establishing a tactical L shape. Davies spoke first. His voice was flat, projecting across the quiet room. He asked Marcus to stand up and provide identification. Marcus remained seated for a moment, keeping his hands clearly visible on his knees. His voice when he spoke was incredibly steady, though he could feel the adrenaline beginning to shake in his chest. He asked, simply and politely, if he was suspected of committing a crime. Davies narrowed his eyes. He wasn't used to immediate pushback on a civilian contact. He stated that they were conducting an investigation into financial fraud and again ordered Marcus to stand and produce his ID. This was the hinge point. The moment where the law transitions from theory to a very stark reality. Marcus stood up slowly, ensuring no sudden movements. He looked directly at Davies and asked if he was being detained. He asked if the officers had reasonable, articulable suspicion that he had committed, was committing, or was about to commit a crime, as required for a Terry stop. He kept his tone completely devoid of aggression, aiming only for clarity. Davies bristled. The invocation of legal terminology from a suspect often triggers a defensive mechanism in law enforcement. Davies took a half step forward. He stated that the finance manager had identified the check as fraudulent, which gave them more than enough reasonable suspicion to detain him, and that if Marcus didn't hand over his ID immediately, he would be placed in handcuffs for obstructing an investigation. Marcus slowly reached into his back pocket using only 2 fingers and extracted his wallet. He handed over his driver's license. But he didn't stop there. He knew the procedural mechanics of what was happening. He knew that Cynthia's claim was an uncorroborated tip. For a civilian's tip to establish reasonable suspicion, it must bear some indicia of reliability. Cynthia had not called the bank. She had no specialized forensic training in document verification. She had only a hunch. Davies was acting on a hunch once removed. But the badge grants a wide latitude of presumed authority, and Davies was operating fully within that presumption. Davies examined the license, radioed the details to dispatch, and then made his critical procedural error. He looked at the leather messenger bag resting on the chair next to Marcus. He told Marcus he needed to search the bag to ensure there were no other forged documents or tools for forgery. Marcus stepped slightly in front of the bag. He stated, clearly and unequivocally, that he did not consent to any searches of his person or his property. He reminded the officer that a Terry frisk is strictly limited to a pat-down of outer clothing for weapons to ensure officer safety, not a warrantless evidentiary search of a bag based on an unsubstantiated phone call. The air in the room grew thick. Several mechanics had wandered out from the service bay and were watching. A couple looking at a sedan near the window had stopped talking. Davies' face flushed. The camera on his chest was a silent witness to a very public challenge to his authority. Davies told Marcus that because he was investigating fraud, the bag was relevant to the investigation, and under the circumstances, he was securing the bag for evidence. He commanded Marcus to step away from the chair, place his hands behind his back, and interlace his fingers. Miller, the younger officer, looked briefly uncertain, shifting his weight, but he followed his senior partner's lead and moved in to secure Marcus's hands. The metal of the handcuffs was shockingly cold against Marcus's wrists. The click of the ratchets echoed through the silent showroom. It was the sound of a boundary being shattered. Marcus did not resist. He went entirely limp, compliant but vocal, stating loudly enough for the camera and the room to hear that he was being subjected to an unlawful detention and an unconstitutional search under the Fourth Amendment without probable cause, based entirely on racial profiling disguised as a fraud investigation. Davies ignored him. He unzipped the messenger bag. He found a laptop, several thick files of software deployment blueprints, a couple of high-end fountain pens, and a corporate ledger. There were no blank checks. There was no forgery equipment. Just the mundane, meticulous tools of a highly successful professional. It was at this exact moment that the heavy glass door of the dealership swung open again, and Richard, the general manager of Westbridge Motors, walked in. Richard was a man whose entire career was built on optics and client retention. He had been at lunch. He walked into his showroom to find 2 police officers, a handcuffed man standing calmly by a chair, and his finance director hovering nervously in the background. Richard's eyes darted from Marcus's face to the bag, to the officers, and then to Josh, the salesman, who was now trembling. Richard recognized Marcus immediately. They had spoken briefly 2 days prior when Marcus had been finalizing the build sheet for the car. Richard dropped his briefcase and practically sprinted across the floor. He demanded to know what was going on. Davies, holding the laptop, stated they were responding to a call from the dealership regarding a forged check. Richard spun around, locking eyes with Cynthia, who was now standing outside her office. Her defensive posture had begun to crack. Richard didn't yell, but his voice was dangerously sharp. He asked her, in front of everyone, if she had called the issuing bank to verify the funds. Cynthia stammered. She said the check looked irregular, the font was slightly off, and the fraud database flagged the transaction size as unusual. She used the word gut feeling. Richard walked over to her desk, picked up the cashier's check from the blue folder, and picked up the phone. He dialed the direct line to the commercial branch 2 miles away. He put it on speakerphone. The showroom was dead silent. After 3 rings, a woman answered. Richard introduced himself, provided the routing number, the account number, and the check sequence. The voice on the speakerphone was crisp and cheerful. The bank manager confirmed that the check was utterly legitimate. She confirmed it had been drawn just hours ago, and then, unprompted, she added a detail that dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. She said, "Is Mr. Vance there? Please tell him congratulations on the new car. We've been handling his corporate accounts for 5 years. He's one of our best clients." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Richard slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle. He turned to Officer Davies. The general manager did not have to say a word. The look of profound, horrifying realization that washed over Davies' face was agonizing to watch. The veteran officer looked down at the bag he had illegally searched. He looked at the handcuffs binding the wrists of a man who had committed no crime, who had broken no law, who had merely attempted to spend his hard-earned money in a place that decided he didn't belong. Davies had bypassed every tenet of the Fourth Amendment, the requirement for probable cause, the strict limitations of a Terry stop, the necessity of corroborating an informant's tip, all because a woman in a nice blazer had a gut feeling that aligned perfectly with his own unexamined biases. Davies fumbled for his keys. He stepped behind Marcus and unlocked the cuffs. He mumbled something that sounded like an apology regarding standard procedure and just trying to get to the bottom of things. Marcus rubbed his wrists slowly. He didn't shout, he didn't throw a tantrum. The anger he felt was far too deep, far too cold for theatrics. He methodically zipped up his messenger bag. He picked it up and slung it over his shoulder. He walked over to Richard, who was profusely apologizing, offering free maintenance, offering to take $5,000 off the sticker price, begging to salvage the sale. Marcus looked at Richard, then looked past him to Cynthia, who was staring at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't want your apologies," Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm, devastating weight of absolute finality. "And I certainly don't want your car." He reached out, plucked his cashier's check from Richard's trembling fingers, and walked out the heavy glass doors, stepping back into the harsh, golden sunlight, leaving the dealership to choke on the silence he left behind. The reality of this encounter isn't found in explosive violence, but in the quiet, terrifying ease with which civil liberties are dismantled in the face of presumption. The Fourth Amendment is designed to be a shield, demanding that the state have measurable, articulable facts before it can lay hands on you or your property. Yet, as we see here, that shield is entirely reliant on the people holding the badge actually honoring the law over their own assumptions. A citizen's baseless suspicion was weaponized by an officer's procedural shortcut, transforming a luxury showroom into a temporary holding cell. There was no instant justice here. The officers simply walked away, shielded by qualified immunity. Cynthia will likely keep her job, perhaps with a quiet reprimand about customer relations. But Marcus walks away with a permanent, indelible reminder that no matter how hard he works, no matter what he achieves, the burden of proving his right to exist in certain spaces will always rest unfairly on his shoulders. It leaves us with a critical question to carry forward. If our constitutional rights can be suspended the moment someone else's unexamined prejudice masquerades as reasonable suspicion, how secure are those rights in the first place? The lesson is stark but necessary. The law is not a magic spell. It is only as strong as our collective willingness to enforce its boundaries. We must recognize that bias isn't always a shouted slur. Most often, it is a quiet phone call, an unwarranted search, and the dangerous assumption that a gut feeling is an adequate substitute for the truth. Understanding the precise mechanics of your rights, knowing the difference between a Terry stop and a lawful search, demanding the articulation of probable cause, is not just legal theory. In a world where assumptions can put you in handcuffs in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, knowing your rights is the only armor you have.